Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome all of you to the SkillsFuture Month in collaboration with Smart Nation 2021, organized by SkillsFuture Singapore and Smart Nation Singapore. Our speaker, Roy, will be sharing the topic, Avoiding Cyber Threats While Maintaining Business Continuity. Throughout the session, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A tab you see on the right panel. Do take note, questions will be moderated. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. So today our webinar is going to be focused, the main focus of the webinar is going to be about building resilience within the corporation. And the main thing I want to focus today is less about the problems and more about a solution or framework of creating solutions within the organizations. A lot of the webinars that I'm usually doing, if some of you have joined in the past, are focusing on the individual, what the individual needs to do on the individual level, whether it's being more aware, resilient, et cetera. And today we are going to cover more the organizational aspect in the context of cybersecurity and building cyber resilience. Please use the Q&A. I'll try to address some of the questions in between, but if not, I'll keep some time at the end to go over them. So please use the Q&A and not just the chat if you want to ask questions, because it will be much easier for me to review the questions in the Q&A box. So as mentioned, my name is Roy. I'm the founder and CEO of Cybint. We are a global cyber education company. We are working in Singapore, mostly with NTUC Learning Hub and some other partners. And today I want to start by talking about the global pandemic, which is actually the cybersecurity pandemic. One of the biggest challenges we are facing globally is not just with COVID, but also with cybersecurity, where we see that the damages or the value at risk that cyber attacks and cyber crimes are creating on the global economy are estimated in hundreds of billions of US dollars annually. So the total estimation in the next 5 years, or between 2019 to 2023, we're already in the middle, is damage of about 5.2 trillion US dollars, right? So it's about like 10 times the GDP of Singapore, the value at risk. But that's on the macro level. When we think about the micro level, it's also affecting significantly every organization and every company. So we see a typical or a steady increase in the cost and damage that are created to companies due to cyber crimes and cyber attacks. And when we see, it's not just in the amount of attacks or the number of attacks, but also in the specific average cost per attack. And it's interesting to look at it from, if we take a specific type of attack, like ransomware, for example, and we see the average cost of ransomware over the years. Let's say we compare 2018 till 2021, for example, right, till the end of the Q1, then we see that actually the costs are increasing every quarter. And we see also that the peak around COVID started. We also had some decrease in Q4, but then it kept on moving up. And what we are actually seeing right now is that if 3 years ago, an average ransomware attack was a few $1,000s per company, right now, the average ransomware attack is a few hundreds of thousands of US dollars per company. And that is just the average. So some companies may face actually ransomware attacks of millions and millions of dollars. And that actually creates a situation where we cannot, remain indifferent, or we cannot remain, I would say, passive to this current situation. We have to take a proactive approach in solving it, not just as cybersecurity professionals, but actually also as financial professionals, as executives, as decision makers. Because eventually, although it is a cybersecurity incident, the result will be a business result. The result may be affecting, of course, financially the company, its ability to continue providing business, its reputation, et cetera, et cetera. And that is why it is critical for us to understand what we should do pre, during, and post a cybersecurity event. By the way, if some of you are from smaller firms versus bigger firms, actually smaller firms, they face largest impacts because of these attacks. Maybe in the total amount, the total amount of damage will be lower, but in percentage, it will be much more significant versus the amount of revenue that the company is doing. So actually risking the ability or the stability of the company to perform. And a lot of time I'm saying in these webinars when I'm addressing it to the Singaporean audience that Singapore as such a great country, such a great nation, just celebrated in this week. But one of the challenges of being such a great nation, such a great country is also it attracts a lot of interest from cyber criminals around the world. So the Singaporean economy, Singapore industry, Singapore data is a target for many different organizations. Some of them are criminal organizations, other are government-led organizations. So this is one of the cons or one of the challenges in being such a great nation, in the Asian or Asia Pacific or Southeast Asia region. Now, what I'm going to address today, I want to give you some kind of like a 10-step approach on how to build a framework to build resilience in cybersecurity within your organization. So this framework that I'm going to present is based on the US framework, NIST 800-300. I didn't take the framework as is. I kind of took components out of this framework and rebuilt it or redesigned it, but I hope it will help you to use it or to implement it in your organization. So this is not actually a technical thing or a technological thing. This is mainly, I would say, a framework that you could apply or could implement in your own organization. And this framework, I'm going to present 10 steps. Step number 1 for this framework is the preparation. First, before we actually start building resilience and before we go into doing like a risk management preparation for our organization, we need to actually do the preparation, right? It's not yet doing the risk management analysis, but actually prepare to this. And it's important that when we start a risk management process or a cybersecurity risk management process, we need to define what do we want to achieve, because it's really important if we are doing it, for example, for compliance purposes. We're doing it because the regulator or the regulation forces us to do it. We're doing it because we want to get, the approval of SOC 2 or one of the ISO approvals, et cetera, or we're doing it for internal reasons, or we are doing it because of we are planning to go IPO, and this is, a requirement in the process, or one of our, our shareholders, the market is expecting us to do it. Maybe one of our, we are a vendor of a big company and they expect us to do this. So it's important to understand why we're doing it, because cybersecurity is important, that's for sure, but we need to understand what is our motivation and what exactly do we want to achieve. And based on this, we need to define the scope, right? Because cybersecurity is a huge, field of expertise. We can cover, it can be very focused on only checking our data centers. If our main, focusing is on privacy, we can check our, applications, our infrastructure, and we can even test our internal security, for our own employees. So this is really important to define the scope as the first step. And then the second step is also to identify what is at risk, because not all companies, not all organizations were born equal in the context or in regards to cyber risks. And let me give you an example. So when we think about cyber risks, there are different types of risks that we need to identify and identify what applies more to our organization. Because, for example, let's say that I am a highly regulated organization, maybe in the financial sector, insurance sector, maybe something in the healthcare industry. In this case, one of the biggest risks that I'm facing is actually not just the cyber attack itself, but maybe fines and penalties from the regulator. Taking the European example, right, with GDPR, and there are some privacy rules, of course, and regulations in Singapore. In the GDPR, which I'm more familiar with, can cause a damage for a company with penalties of 20 million euros or up to 4% of the total global revenue of the company. So some companies with tens of billions of dollars of revenue can actually find that the biggest risk for them is the penalty, is the fine, and not even the cyber attack itself. And in that case, we need to understand that this is actually the risk that we are trying to solve. Another type of businesses could be businesses where the biggest risk is actually the reputational damage, right? Let's say, for example, I'm a cybersecurity company, right? So as a cybersecurity company facing a cybersecurity attack, the reputational damage will probably be more significant than a company that works in retail. No company wants to be a victim of a cyber attack, but some companies, just by being a victim, regardless of what is the damage itself, the reputational damage is immense, is very significant. So we see it in companies, of course, in cybersecurity, but also in companies that manage sensitive data, banks, insurance companies, healthcare organizations, government organizations. These would probably care more, or not necessarily more, but care a lot about the reputational damage, right? Other companies, it's about the business continuity, meaning that it's not actually the damage from the attack or the reputation, but every minute that their servers may be down, every minute that they're not providing services, the damage may be significant. Let's think, for example, about cloud providers, providers of cloud solutions. Let's say, for example, the biggest example, AWS, right, is facing right now, assuming it was be facing right now a global cyber crisis. If AWS servers are suffering from right now from the ability to operate, not only that affects Amazon, of course, as a company, but it affects millions of companies around the world that right now are suffering from the fact that the servers are down or not operating or slow or whatever it is. And that, of course, will cause such a huge damage also to the business itself, because these organizations will lose trust. Maybe we'll find other solutions. We'll say, well, if we cannot trust this, this infrastructure, maybe we need to use our own. And then actually the business is losing a lot, not from the direct attack, but from everything that happens around it. So as an organization, when we started the preparation and understand why we are doing the cyber analysis, we also need to understand and map what are the biggest risks, that are relevant to us. Because maybe not all risks are that important to us. Maybe we are in a less regulated area, then fines are less important. And this is, I know it's kind of like it may be a bit difficult to understand what we're seeing here, so I'll explain, and I'll show you how, for example, being in a highly regulated environment is important to analyze the damage. So let's take, for example, data breaches, right? So that's an example from the United States. So a typical data breach is being discovered only a few months after it actually happens. And then we see a significant cost of course, the entire process of remediation and recovery from the attack, et cetera, et cetera. And with time, the cost of this attack is, going down and down, because we, let's say a year, 2 years post the attack, most of the costs have already been incurred. But what we can see here, and I know it may be a bit difficult, in the pink versus the green areas, that you can see that in highly regulated, industries, actually 2 years after the cyber attack, 2 years after the data breach, you can see that there's another peak of costs that companies suffer. And this peak of costs is actually due to the regulation. So usually when we think about what happens 2 years post-attack, then this is the situation where the companies are paying the fines or suffering from the regulator different penalties. So we need to understand that this is a big deal when we think about how we are managing our cyber incidents, how we are managing our financial resources, our insurance for cyber attacks, et cetera, et cetera. The industry we are operating in is really, really important. So after we defined the scope and the reasons, and we identify the different types of threats, then we need to start identifying and prioritizing assets. And what do I mean? So when we think about cybersecurity, there's kind of like a circle or a cycle of processes, never ending, ever going. But the first step is usually to identify what is really important to us. What are the crown jewels that we actually need to protect, and focus on them in our risk analysis and also in the protection. A lot of time I'm giving it as an example, let's say from the physical space, not just the cyberspace. Let's say, you're a company that has, let's say 1,000 warehouses around Asia Pacific region, and every one of them is protected with a specific lock. Again, it's a stupid example, but maybe it will be easier to think about it like this. And you cannot send maybe guards to protect all of these warehouses. It's too much. But that in a few of them you have equipment or maybe some assets that are more important than others. Then probably you will invest more in protecting these, to guard these. Maybe in one of these warehouses, you actually keep the keys to all the other warehouses, So that in that case, it means that this is a critical area that you will focus your efforts in protecting it. So the same thing with cybersecurity, the same thing when we think about the cybersecurity space. We need to understand what is more critical to us to protect. And that also goes back to what is the main damage that we are trying to prevent. For example, if we have database with data about customers, then anyway, we want to protect it. But if we also are under privacy regulations, and now we can expose customers or customer data, to a breach and suffer from significant fines, then that's actually a big problem that we want to solve. So we need to really understand where we want to put the focus, and we need to have a clear, I would say, mapping of the resources that we have in the organizations. The main databases, where do we keep the critical information, the critical elements that we need to protect, and understand that it's kind of like managing inventory. We really need to understand and to be aware where is this located and how this is being guarded. So this is this important process of risk prioritization, and eventually we can say, well, these are the valuable assets. This is the value at risk that they pose on the company. And then we understand exactly what is the most critical element versus the less critical element. And then the next step is to identify the threats. So when we think about identifying threats, we think about, different types of threats around the world. So, not just in the cybersecurity concept, there are a lot of threats out there that companies need to protect against. When we think about, it can be global crisis like we see right now, with pandemic. It can be weather situation. It can be terror attacks. It can be competitors that are, going into market right now. But we are today in the context of cybersecurity. So when we think about cybersecurity, we think about different attack vectors and threat actors. And we need to identify what are the main threat actors that I am protecting against, So for example, when we think about, let's think about a company that is working in a critical infrastructure environment, let's say, gas or water or power system, etc. These kind of industries are actually more sensitive to nation state attacks a lot of times, not necessarily by, let's say, or terrorist groups versus cyber criminals. Cyber criminals can also target these, but critical infrastructure, a lot of time it's a target of a nation state versus financial institutions that also nation states sometimes target, but cyber criminals target more. Or institutions, organizations that are in fields that hacktivists or, let's call them hackers that work for ideology target. So it's important to understand in our industry, what are the main threat actors that pose, that are the main risks to us, because then we need to prepare our organization against the relevant type of threat. Now, in general, cyber criminals is the biggest group. You know, about 80% of all cyber attacks are actually due to cyber crimes and not necessarily nation states or inside threat. So everyone is affected by cyber crimes, but if you're in an industry that is also affected by other types of cyber attackers, then you need to have a different plan or a different preparation for these types of for these types of attacks. Now, in general, you know, it's really important that we need to understand that there are also different types, not just of threat actors, but also on threat vectors. You know, there are different types of attacks. Some of them are more, I would say, malware based. Other are actually more based on the human factor. So we also need to understand and how to protect the organization against different types of attacks, and in general to map the different types of scenarios and different type of from different type of malware to different type of more social engineering attacks that our organization can be a target of, and make sure that the organization is ready for every one of these situations. And to do this, you know, one of the things that we recommend, you know, organizations to do in the risk analysis process is also to implement some what we call threat intelligence processes, which means in processes that allow the organization to put the relevant intelligence sources and collect information to prevent the attack before it happens. And let me give you an example. So a few years ago, there was an attack against a Canadian bank, or two Canadian banks. So one of them was Bank of Montreal, and to the best of my knowledge. And what happened there is the bank suffered from an attack, and the bank was not aware of that. And end of May 2018, the bank received this note, this letter, you know, email saying, hey, you've been hacked. We, the hackers, now hold 90,000 personal data of 90,000 Canadians. You know, and we are going to release this information unless you pay us $1 million. This is actually not what we define as ransomware, because ransomware is usually where the files are locked, are encrypted, and you need to pay the ransom to get the key. In this case, not the files were not locked, but the hackers said, well, we have your data. Now you need to pay $1 million, or you know, otherwise we'll just release it. And the bank decided not to pay, and the hackers released it. Now you could say, you know, that's a decision that the bank made, and they couldn't, you know, they couldn't know if this is a good or a bad decision. But if the bank, you know, were implementing some intelligence resources prior to the attack, the bank could see two things. One, the bank could see that about 2-3 weeks before it got the ransom note, there were actually a lot of transactions in dark web marketplaces, which I will address in a minute, that hackers were actually already selling users and accounts of this bank's clients, meaning that the bank could have known about the attack even 2-3 weeks before the bank got the ransom note, because already we saw transactions in the market where, you know, in the different dark web marketplaces. Now, it doesn't mean that that would prevent the attack, because that actually means that the attack already happened, because they already trade with the users, but it still gives the bank a few weeks to mitigate the risk, to remediate the situation, and also to know that you should not pay in this situation anyway, because already the data was released. Having said that, you can even take a few months back and see that in late 2017, so like half a year before the attack, in different hacking forums, there were different hacking groups talking about how to target this bank specifically, you know, or these Canadian banks. So the bank could have known, or these banks could have known, that they are going to be a target, and in this case, increase the level of defense, maybe invest more, etc., etc. And it's important to understand that, you know, you need to know when you are a target, because you could say, well, you should always invest in cybersecurity, which is true, but eventually there is a limit of how much a company is willing to invest in anything, including in cybersecurity. You know, a company that makes, just for the example, A company that makes $100 million in revenue will not invest $50 million in cybersecurity. Probably not also 10, probably not 5 as well, maybe, it's just, but if this company knows that right now it is a target of a hacking group, et cetera, maybe in that specific, fiscal year, in this specific quarter, in that specific effort, they will invest a lot of resources, or the CFO, the financial experts will allow to go off the budget plan because right now there is an immediate threat. So when we think about mapping threats, we need to think about 3 levels of threats: strategic, operational, and tactical. Strategic threats is kind of like the trends in the world. For example, right now, a strategic threat that is changing is ransomware, that is increasing significantly. It's not specifically about your industry, my industry, your organization, my organization. In general, ransomware is growing. So that's a strategic threat, meaning that's a big, big global challenge, meaning that we need to invest more in ransomware protection. That's great. Operational may be something that is specific to your industry. So for example, right now there is a, line or wave of attacks against financial institutions. And let's say you're a financial institution. So not necessarily there is something against your institution, but you need to be aware of that right now and put the right, let's say, measures in place or tools in place to allow you to prevent it. And a tactical attack, meaning like this example, somebody is addressing your organization. And when we think about building a resilience plan, we also need to understand who's targeting us, and also to understand how we are building this intelligence plan in place. And there are different tools, different companies, some companies that we work with like Insights or SixGill and other organizations. And eventually they actually send their sensors to places like the dark web, different marketplaces, and collect the relevant information to find out, eventually what type of threats are out there, what type of threats are trending, and what is the main risk, again, different organizations. By the way, in our training programs that we do together with NTC Learning Hub, like the CBFP or the CSPC, so the CBFP specifically, we cover the concept of dark web, to understand how this thing works, because it's really important to understand it. It's really important to understand how it affects the different risks against our company. So after we did these first stages, we defined the scope of the threat. We understood, in this case, we did all the preparation. We went through all this process, including identifying the threats. Then we need to identify the vulnerabilities. And what are vulnerabilities? A lot of time we define vulnerabilities under the words or concept of CVE. These are the CVE concept of common vulnerabilities. These are actually a lot of time when we define vulnerabilities versus exploits, we need to understand that different software that we are using may have different vulnerabilities. And some hackers may find a way to take advantage of this vulnerability, and then it becomes an exploit. Then they actually found a way to exploit it and find a way to, to either use it to gain access to your system, or to lock your system, or to spy on your system, et cetera, et cetera. So what's important in the risk management process is also to understand what kind of tools my organization is using. And a lot of times this is something that people that are not in the security or IT, they put less emphasis on that. They're just using different tools. They want to keep, the work as efficient as possible, and it makes sense. So we're using different tools, not necessarily tools that were vetted by the necessary, entities within the organization. And then there may be a situation where there are critical vulnerabilities within these tools. So we need to make sure that we have a process within our organization of a clear process for patching, patching the system, patching the software. And this is something that for big organizations with thousands of different devices and software and applications, this is a very, very challenging process. So we also need to prioritize the different type of vulnerabilities. And we need to first patch and address the critical vulnerabilities and then just get to the, let's say, to the other vulnerabilities in line. Now, after we understood the threats, we also need to understand what kind of controls, what kind of solutions we have in place. So for example, different organizations, they invest in three main elements when they think about building protection for the organization. One, which is maybe the clear example, is technology. A lot of time when people think about cybersecurity, they think about, yeah, I'm buying new technology. I'm buying this new firewall, this endpoint security. I'm buying this tool that does the network scanning, et cetera, et cetera. But technology is actually one part of this equation, or one part of this triangle of technology, processes, and people. Because when we need to understand, what controls are in place, it's not just what technology we acquired to protect or license to protect our organization. It is also how we trained and what kind of our people and what skills and level of skills they have, and also what processes we have in place. Do we have a process for example, for incident response? Do we have a process that when right now there is an attack, I know exactly what I need to do, me as an organization and me as an individual, me as the CFO, me as the chief of marketing, me as the compliance officer? Is there a process in place? And have I practiced this process? Did I do the fire drills for cybersecurity or not? Because when we look at the controls, we may find out that we invested a lot in technology, but actually we forgot to invest in people, or processes, which may be even more important in some cases. So we need to think about, people, technologies, processes, and also to think about the different stages of this attack. Solutions to identify, to protect, to detect, to respond, and to recover. These are different solutions. Sometimes, a lot of time we think about protection, but not everything can be prevented. Not every attack can be blocked. Some attacks at some point may find their way through, and then we need to detect them. And some events that were either not detected or not detected on time will cause damage, and then we need to respond. And then afterwards, we need to recover. So we need to have this plan in place and tools and processes and solutions and training of people to address the different stages of the cyber attack. Now, what's important is that eventually it's pretty obvious to say, we need to protect against cyber attacks, we need to prepare ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need to analyze the probability versus the risk. So when we think about different types of cyber attacks and where we want to invest most of our efforts, eventually we need to understand, kind of like taking the risk analysis metrics, understanding what events have a higher risk, or I would say a higher damage if it happens, and what have higher probability. And then of course, events that are frequent, and also catastrophic, or just major, are the main events that we should focus on preventing. Now, if there is something catastrophic, or major, but it's extremely improbable that it will happen, then not necessarily we have to prepare our organization against it. And I'll address it in a minute, because eventually it's kind of like the Pareto rule, a lot of time investing 80% of the, or 20% of the effort will cover 80% of the risks. And then to cover the last 20%, you need to invest a lot of money. And sometimes, sometimes when we eventually prioritize the risk and we kind of like doing this risk assessment, sometimes some risks are not the highest priority, even in cybersecurity. And we need to analyze that, because eventually when we need to build resilience in our organization, we also need to know where to focus our efforts. Because as I said before, we will not be able to protect against everything, and will not be able to prevent everything, you know? And that is why when we think about cybersecurity, and I'll skip this slide, eventually it's about cost-effective analysis. Cost-effective analysis, where do we invest? And one of the topics of this today's webinar is also about business continuity. Because it's, if we just want to be as protected as possible, we may actually cause damages to the business side. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you are managing an app that gives customers access to their bank account, or to something super sensitive or to some private information. And one of the ways for you to make it more protected is that you ask like multi-factor authentication from the customer, which is great. But let's say you decided now to implement that after every page, every click they do, they need to authenticate themselves again and again and again and again. Put their password, put their, get a text message, do it again and again and again to increase the level of security. But in that case, you will probably lose business. You will lose customers because they will not like it. They will not like using your apps, or you want to work with, your sales team is telling you, I want to communicate with my customers or with prospects. Give me the ability to send and receive files. You're blocking files, or you change the definition of the email scanner. So 95% of emails coming from clients are not coming through. I don't see them. I'm losing business. So it's not that obvious to say, invest in cybersecurity. That's the obvious thing to say, but investing in cybersecurity is exactly this, finding the right balance between the business operation and the risk management, finding the right balance. And if I'm going back to what type of business am I, what type of industry am I working at, that also defines how risk averse, I am, or how much I'm willing to take risk to improve, business operations, to improve efficiency, etc. Or I cannot allow myself to take any risks. So eventually, this is something that needs to be managed. And in that point, we introduced the concept of cyber insurance, cybersecurity insurance, because exactly for these areas where it doesn't necessarily make sense now to invest more to, eliminating, to prevent this improbable event, maybe the insurance can cover it, because you don't need to invest all the resources to eliminate this improbable event. You'll pay it for the insurance. So in the worst case scenario, that this event will actually happen, although it was improbable. And then of course, once an event happens, then the fact that statistically it shouldn't, have happened, or, the probability was low. Right now, once it happens, it happens, now we see the 100% of the damage because it happens. In that case, that's where we use insurance. And that's where we understand, well, this improbable event may be catastrophic. So I'm willing to pay something for the insurance to, although it's improbable, if it will happen, I don't want to be in a situation where it will risk my business or my ability to keep performing business. So this is, in my point of view, this is where we implement cybersecurity insurance. We can implement it from the first dollar, but in general, we first need to see where we can, lower the risk, minimize the risks on our own. And of course, this will probably be reflected in our insurance premiums. And then some areas that we understand that we cover them less and we take a risk there. And to make sure this risk is calculated, we implement insurance. So this is part of the planning process, and this is why it's a financial discussion. It's a financial decision. Of course, if you ask the security team, the security will want everything to be as secured as possible. But this is why they don't see the full business, right? You need to think about what's the COO and CFO and CRO if they have chief revenue or chief of sales, or how will they react? So the CISO and the CIO are kind of like looking at. So eventually, we need to balance it. We need to balance the different needs of the organization. And for financial professionals, that's exactly it. This is exactly it. Eventually, this is a profit and loss situation. And we need to manage it and calculate it and measure the probability and exposure, et cetera, And eventually, if something happens, we'll also need to be able, to explain this to our shareholders, to the board, shareholders, to the regulator in some cases, and present and show that we made decisions that made sense. It made sense from not from a hunch or from a feeling. It made sense based on calculations that we did. So eventually, what we should have in every organization, and in my point of view, every organization, almost in every size, maybe very, very small organizations don't need it, need to develop eventually a report, an internal report, in which they take these different elements that I mentioned or others. It's not like, this is not the, this is not a set of rules. This is like guidelines or framework that I'm suggesting based on the NIST framework, and eventually develop a report that being provided to the decision maker within the organization, saying what needs to be implemented, to lower the risk. So this is an example, just a print screen from a report that I received from, not to my company, but I received from a colleague of mine that is doing these reports for companies. And this report identified the different risks, both in cybersecurity and in privacy for the specific organization. Now, one thing that I want to say, or a few things that I want to say, and this is kind of like focusing this discussion on what I think can be the biggest, reduction in risk, and not just me. What we see actually is that in most industries, the biggest reduction, right, in the probability of breach or in the damage from a cyber attack will be due to investing in people. So if I have to choose between investing more in technologies, processes, or people, on average, I'm not saying that this is the right decision in every situation, but on average, investing more in people, meaning in training, in skilling, reskilling, upskilling, from workshops to online training, from internal protocols to fire drills, as I said, this is providing a significant return on investment versus other elements. And when we think about how the world is going digital, like the digital transformation age is here. It's here for many years now, but it's just accelerating. Then we need to understand that it's not just about protecting the systems, it's also protecting the systems from the people, from our own people. Because the weakest link in cybersecurity is the human person, it's the human element, is the person. And people think that they are not important enough to be targeted, but they don't need to be targeted. They're just there, making mistakes, being sensitive to social engineering, just being part of a big network of people. You and your connections and their connections and their connections, and eventually we are all connected. For example, probably I don't know personally any one of the people in this call, or maybe I know some of you, of course, but most of you I probably don't know personally. But right now, you and I have 1 degree of separation. NTUC Learning Hub, right? So NTUC Learning Hub, if you're here, probably or SkillsFuture or whatever, from Smart Nation, from wherever you received this invitation, I also received this invitation, right? So right now, you and me, we're connected. So we are almost in the same network on that sense. And think about companies and vendors and different tools that you're using. So that's the same thing. We need to understand that this is not someone else's problem. This is definitely our problem. And that's where, for example, where Cybint, my company, now also Cybint partner with some other big companies in the education space, that we launch a global education partnership. Specifically in Singapore, we work very closely with NTUC Learning Hub, and we focus on reskilling and upskilling Singapore, in cybersecurity. So the different programs that we introduced in Singapore, like the CSPC first, and now the CBFP, these one-day focus programs, they focus on behavior modifying experience. Like my session, just better, just better, because eventually this was a very speedy event where I'm talking about different situations, but in these sessions we go a bit deeper in how to implement these things, to see the different types of threats we need to avoid, And eventually, this is something that, I'm a bit biased because I'm a big believer in cybersecurity training, but I think this is something that every organization needs to do, especially organizations that are in spaces that are more data-driven, or regulated, from finance to healthcare, from different types of, data-driven organizations that I would say it's 80% of organizations today in Singapore. So this is something, and even in other areas like critical infrastructure, oil, gas, these type of things that are also can be a target for ransomware or different types of infrastructure attacks. This is really, really, important. So eventually what we have here, and you can use this QR code, and I'll answer questions in a minute, but you can use this QR code provided by NTUC Learning Hub. Just take your phone, scan it. You can look at it and have all the information, about the CBFP, or what we call the Cybersecurity Essentials for business and finance professionals. And this is a very recommended course. And we also have, there's a quiz right here that is being provided. I don't know if somebody from SkillsFuture or NTC Learning Hub wants to talk about that, but I'll let them address this before I answer any question. So I'll stop here, then I'll take questions, but if there's anything that one of the other hosts wants to add.
Yeah, hi, this is James here. So I think you guys can actually scan the QR code here, and it will direct you to a simple quiz, and it's a simple game where you can just set it up in a few steps.
Great. So let me take a look at some of the questions to see, to see if there is anything I can add to what I already mentioned. So I see one question: how to train individual to be attuned to cyber kill chain. So in general, we are covering in the different programs, the CBFP, the CSPC, the different aspects of the different aspects of the kill chain. We're not going too deep there, but still, this is something that is covered. So I believe that the program is covering this type of information. I see to what extent should businesses or business handle third-party data, take on their own liability toward, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say that we need to understand, if I understand the question correctly, then we also need to understand that if we are sharing data, of course, with third parties, other than privacy issues, or if we're giving third parties access to our systems or solutions, whether there are vendors or anything like this, we actually have a lot of responsibility, not just by law, not just by regulation, but also by the expectations of our customers. We need to make sure that they are also following the rules, and they also implement the necessary security mechanisms, or they also train their own employees. So I know a lot of companies, bigger companies, that actually in their training programs, they also train their clients, or at least their vendors in some cases. Meaning if they have big vendors that they are working with, or even small vendors that are not qualified enough in cybersecurity, then they actually make sure, some of them are not even allowing these vendors to work with them. But assuming you want to work with this vendor, then you have to have a way to test or to assure or reassure that they actually have the right skills. So this is something really, really important. I see another question: how would bank have access to deep dark web if it's not searchable from search engine? So it's not searchable by Google, for example, or the regular search engines, but there are search engines and tools. Some of them are open, but most of the more advanced ones are designed by these threat intelligence companies. I mentioned some of these names like Insights or 6Gill and others. So you can either build your own threat intelligence team and deploy your own sensors, which is very expensive. In some cases, medium organizations and small organizations cannot really afford it. And in that case, you probably use like a third-party provider of this. Big organizations, sometimes they design their own threat intelligence, mechanisms. So this is one of these things that it depends on your size. So so let's see the next question, right? So somebody said, think user awareness is more important. Well, user awareness, I don't know if this is, I actually agree that user awareness is really important, but we need to go beyond awareness. Awareness, the problem with awareness is that there are a lot of things that I'm aware of that are not good to me. For example, right here next to me, there is, I'm not trying to promote anything, but there is a can of Diet Pepsi, right? I'm drinking Diet Pepsi. I usually prefer Diet Coke, but I have Diet Pepsi here. Well, it's not good to me, right? I know it's not good. I know it's probably not healthy. Again, I'm not trying to say anything against Pepsi or Diet Coke, but I'm still drinking it. Some people are still smoking or drinking or eating things that are not healthy, although they are aware of that. So awareness is not, awareness does not equal behavior modifying, event. We need to change mindset. This is what we're trying to do in the training. I'm not saying that it works with everyone, but this is exactly what we're trying to do. We are trying to create this event, emotional situation that changes their behavior, at least for a few months, until they need to do it again, like a booster, just for cyber awareness. So this is a bit different than just check the box, if you ask someone, are you allowed to download links that you don't know, or are you allowed to open files from people that you don't know? Of course, they'll say, yeah, I'm aware that I should not, I should not do it. So this is just something that needs to be addressed beyond the awareness level. So I see another question. With many of us working from home, right? What are some of the steps we can take to protect ourselves against these attacks? So I'd say in general, there are a lot of things that we should do. Working from home, as an organization, we need to make sure that our employees are also trained for these types of things. So things like, working with VPN if we are working with public networks, making sure that, we manage what kind of access we provide to people that are actually accessing from external to our people that are external to our organization, people that are not right now working in the office. We need to make sure that we manage the, manage permissions as an organization. We manage them better. We need to make sure that as much as possible to implement two-factor multi-factor authentications. So this is important. I see, by the way, one of the other comments would be that using biometric, right? Like fingerprint sensor, and not just password. So multi-factor can also be biometric, right? Depends on the organization, the country, the regulation, etc. So eventually, everything that just makes it more difficult for the hacker to address, to eventually to I would say, let me rephrase. I'd say a lot of times it's not about being 100% protected, is just being more protected than the others. Kind of like there's this joke of two people, there is a bear and two people running, seeing the bear and running away from the bear. And the question is, and both of them are not as fast as the bear, but the joke says that you don't really need to outrun the bear, you just need to outrun the other person. Of course, it's not really a nice joke, but this is the same situation here. Eventually some organizations will become victim. I hope none, but some will become victim. So let's start by making sure that it's not you. Now, if everyone will do this and provide more and more defense mechanisms, then the situation will be much better. So, in general, I see there are other questions here, but our time's almost up. So I'll just say, to summarize this, and I'll take some of these questions. I'll ask one of my team members here to send me the questions later and see if we can answer and maybe post some of these answers if relevant through the relevant networks. But I would say that I highly recommend focusing on training It can be with us, it can be with others, but I'd recommend the CBFP, of course. And I hope this session was helpful. And now I'm passing the baton, or passing the speaking back to the team here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roy. So ladies and gentlemen, before the session ends, please scan the QR code and provide your feedback or comments on the webinar. And lastly, I'd like to share with you about our skills and training advisory service. If you're not sure how to get started on your upskilling journey, you can sign up for the free one-to-one skills and training advisory session, where a skills ambassador will guide you in understanding your career goals and provide suitable course recommendations. Simply scan on the QR code and indicate SFMX Smart Nation in the mandatory field, "How do you hear about us?" at the bottom of the registration form. Our skills ambassadors will contact you within 2 to 3 working days. We've come to the end of the webinar and we thank you for joining us. Hope you have gained important insights from our speaker. Thank you and hope to see you in the other sessions.